All right, good evening, everyone. Great to see you back. Looks like I scared some people off, but it's all right. Bound to happen. In the interwar period between World War I and World War II, a Jewish self-help organization published this Shana Tova card, this Rosh Hashanah card. And on it was a picture of the two men that you see in front of you, and it has the following description there on the bottom. Now, I hope you don't mind as I read this in my terribly American Yiddish. It says something like this: Dietz zu Chassid, Recht zu Arein, Recht eich briderlech die Hand. Lashana Tova tichatevu, wer ihr seid, und wem ihr seid. And it means German or Chassid, rich or poor, shake a brotherly hand. May you be inscribed for a good year, no matter who or how you are. So what's clear from this Rosh Hashanah card is that already by the time we get post-World War I, so still the beginnings of the 20th century, in Europe itself, there was a recognition that there were two different kinds of Jews. There was the Dietsch, and there was the Chassid. I don't know if I'm reading too much into it, but I see the Chassid looking down on the Dietsch. I see a building in the back here, probably a yeshiva of sort. I see a very different kind of building with columns. Right? Here behind the German, I see a long black coat on the Chassid. I see a 3/4 length coat here on the Deitsch. I see an old cap from Eastern Europe here. I see a more modern Western European hat over here. And so it wouldn't surprise you that YIVO has the greatest library of Yiddish material anywhere. YIVO cataloged this particular Shana Tova card with the following note. It says a Rosh Hashanah greeting card, postcard depicting a Reform and an Orthodox Jew shaking hands. The Yiddish verse reads exactly as I said it. So, a Reform and an Orthodox Jew shaking hands. Clear then that by early the 20th century there was a rift between them. Right? That there was something that was clearly dividing them, so much so that the postcard has to call that for now on Rosh Hashanah, this year Rosh Hashanah, we should all shake hands. Jews should begin to get along. If you recall our story from last time, by the end of the 18th century, the late 18th century, turn of the 19th century, there was no such thing as a Reform Jew. Right? The Jews were Jews. By the time we get into the 20th century, things were so separate that we had to call for them to shake hands. So our story today isn't about Orthodox Jews necessarily. It's going to focus more on the story of what we would call ultra-Orthodox Jews, of which this man would certainly belong. And I've given this lecture many times before. Perhaps one of the first times that I gave it to undergrads at Yeshiva University, and I said we were going to explore the origins of ultra-Orthodoxy. I had a student raise their hand and say, "What do you mean the origins of ultra-Orthodoxy? Weren't we always ultra-Orthodox?" And my answer is no, we were not. In fact, there's quite a difference between what we see today and what was. Ultra-Orthodoxy needs to be seen as a modern movement, as something which developed in a particular time, in a particular space. The great historian Jacob Katz, who was one of the great historians of the 20th century, Jewish historians of the 20th century, makes the following distinction. He says, up until the 19th century, up until the story that we're about to tell, you could refer to Jews as traditional. Coming out of the 19th century, Jews transitioned from traditional to traditionalist. What's the difference between a traditional Jew and a traditionalist Jew? Well, they practice, as we'll see, wasn't 100% the same, but even if it was, a traditionalist Jew, well, let me start with the other. A traditional Jew does things because their parents did it, and their parents before them did it. It's the way they grew up, it's what they've experienced, it's what they know. A traditionalist Jew does something because, what do you think? Because it's not what somebody else is doing. Because somebody else is doing something else, I am therefore going to do this. Right? A traditionalist means I'm defining myself against an other. So even if a traditional Jew kept Shabbat and a traditionalist Jew keeps Shabbat, if one of the motivating factors for why I keep Shabbat or how I keep Shabbat is because I don't want to be defined as what those people are doing, I'm separating myself from what those people are doing, it becomes something qualitatively different. And that really is the story that we're going to tell today. So this was what I asked you to commit to memory last week. I know that some of you did. So we started, this is kind of the sketch of everything that we're going to be doing, starting from the European Enlightenment, taking us all the way down to the end of the 19th century, with the creation of at least 3 different major institutions here in the United States. But if you recall from last time, my point in showing this to you was less to have you committed to memory, but more to show you the different colors, right? And point out that while we're going to be telling 4 individual stories over the course of this series, they aren't individual stories. They're actually intertwining stories. They happen all at the same time in reaction to one another. We're going to pull each one out and tell the story separately, but that doesn't mean that they took place in a vacuum. So, last time we told this story of the birth of the Reform movement, starting with the Hamburg Temple controversy in 1818, through the emergence of Abraham Geiger, the Reform rabbinical conferences of the 1840s, and ultimately the creation of the Reform movement here in the United States. It shouldn't be surprising then that the story we're going to tell today starts in the very same place. It starts with the reaction to the Hamburg Temple controversy back in 1818 and 1819. So, let's go there. Hamburg. The New Israelite Temple Association Constitution of the Hamburg Temple, December 11th, 1817. We noted that in the decades leading up to this point, there were really 2 foci, 2 areas in which early reformers were focused. One was on education. There were new schools that were beginning to emerge that would incorporate secular studies even for Jews. We didn't spend much time on that before. But in addition was the focus on aesthetics. That these were new Jews that were living in a post-French Revolutionary world where everything had been turned on its head. They were living in a world that had gone through 2 centuries now of enlightenment, ideas of freedom, ideas of science, ideas of rationality were very much seeped into their culture, even to the Jewish culture, by the time we get to the 19th century. And so Jews, young Jews living in this post-revolutionary world, look around at their contemporaries and at religious practice in other communities, and their religious practice simply does not measure up. It doesn't speak to them, it doesn't inspire them, it doesn't do for them what they would hope that religion would do. There was a second motivating factor. What did we say that was? What was the second factor that was pushing Jews now to look more like those around them, to practice more like those around them? Say it again. Belong. To belong, exactly, but from a legal perspective, right? More than anything. So I skipped over this, right, rather quickly, right? But we mentioned that in the first decade of the 19th century, right, following the French Revolution, Napoleon will go and take over almost all, right, of Western Europe at the time. He makes his way all the way to Russia, right? But we know that doesn't work out terribly well. What's important for the Jewish communities of this time is that Napoleon will take the enlightened ideas of France and of the French Revolution, begin to bring it to these German states, whether it's Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony, all of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, conquer it all, bring with them these ideas of equality for all, including Jews, we saw. Not so clear that that would happen, but it did. And then Napoleon's defeated. And he's chased back from Russia all the way back to Paris, and then he's ultimately exiled. And with it, and in its place, comes a rise in nationalism. Right? A sense that Germans, Prussians, Bavarians don't want to be French. In fact, they don't want to associate with what France associated with. So the ideas of universal citizenship, as imagined by Napoleon, are being replaced by ideas of what does it mean to be Prussian? What does it mean to be Bavarian? And one thing that it means to be Prussian and Bavarian is that you are not Jewish. So we find yourselves in this enlightened space, post-French Revolution, young people who've now been educated, Jews who've been educated, but in a world that is not accepting of them, right? That is actually now pushing back against these freedoms which they just got only a few years prior. And so you have Jews coming together to do things like the Hamburg Temple. Right? And the focus here was on the type of worship. So, since public worship has for some time been neglected by so many because of the ever-decreasing knowledge of the language in which alone it has until now been conducted, and also because of many other shortcomings which have crept in at the same time, the undersigned, convinced of the necessity to restore public worship to its deserving dignity and importance, have joined together to follow the example of several Israelite congregations, especially the one in Berlin. They plan to arrange in the city also, for themselves as well as for others who think as they do, a dignified and well-ordered ritual according to which the worship service shall be conducted on the Sabbath and the holy days and other solemn occasions, and which shall be observed in their own temple to be erected especially for this purpose. They were going to build a temple that was dignified, that was orderly, that would speak to the hearts of the people of the time. Specifically, there shall be introduced at such services a German sermon and a choral singing to the accompaniment of an organ. Incidentally, the above-mentioned ritual shall not be confined to services in the temple. Rather, it shall apply to all those religious customs and acts of daily life which are sanctified by the church or by their own nature. Outstanding amongst these are the entrance of the newly born into the covenant of the fathers, weddings, and the like. Also, a religious ceremony shall be introduced in which the children of both sexes, after having received adequate schooling in the teachings of the faith, shall be accepted as confirmation of the Mosaic religion. So, this proposal, which was being given to whom? Who did such a proposal have to go to? The government, exactly. Right? Hamburg actually at the time was called a free city. It had its own standing government. Right? And so to create a synagogue, all religious activity went through the government. Right? So if you wanted to open a synagogue, you needed to petition the government for permission to open the synagogue. And that is what this constitution was an attempt to do. And in this constitution, there were really three items that stood out as being significantly different, even than the other reform type of synagogues like the ones in Berlin, which had preceded it. Number one, that parts of davening were going to be said in German. Number two, any references to the temple right, to the rebuilding of the temple or return to Israel were taken out of the liturgy. And number three, that an organ was going to be played by a non-Jew along with a choir, right, on Shabbat and Yom Tov.
What's the significance of a non-Jew?
Oh, because it would be worse if it was played by if a Jew played the organ on Shabbat. At this point, and this is important to the story, everything that was being done with justification from a halachic perspective, right? And that was very important to those in Hamburg, and that's exactly the story we're about to tell. Right? So we pointed this out. We showed you an example. Right? This comes from their siddur, example from the Musaf prayers, and this is the English version of it, where you can see, we're not going to read it all again, but what has been crossed out, the references to returning of the exiles, right? Coming back to Zion, coming back to your city, your temple, all of that sort of crossed out. Any reference to doing sacrifices again, crossed out, right? And instead, right, that we should talk about them, we can remember them, but it's not something that we actually intend to do. And so to Lando's point, right, because it was important for these reformers that everything that they do have a halachic basis to it, they immediately turned to a group of rabbis to write teshuvot, to write responsa literature that would support from a halachic, a Jewish law perspective, why each of the things that they were proposing to do was acceptable by Jewish law. This was the first version of that. This is Aaron Chorin. Of the rabbis who participated in this, he was considered to be the most significant Talmid Chacham, the most significant of the rabbinic scholars involved. And you can see this was published in Dessau in 1818. Pretty soon afterwards, a man by the name of Eliezer Lieberman, who had been involved in that first publication, writes a second work. This one he calls Or Noga. And this one, he was going to go point by point and address the issues that the traditional rabbinate in Hamburg had raised with their petition. So let's take a step back again. In order to open the synagogue, they needed permission from the city, the state. The state turns to the rabbinic court of the area, right, and says, do they have permission? Is this a justified, right, petition? Is this a legitimate synagogue? The Beit Din says, no, it's not, for the following reasons. They are doing things which run counter to Judaism. Comes along, right, Eliezer Lieberman, and says, point by point, here's why that's not true. Here are all the reasons why, here's what they are raising, and here are the answers to them. So before we get into what he actually lists here, it's important to point out, right, a preface here to this book. It starts, and you'll see why I didn't translate it in a second, it starts, Ve'ele divrei hashir, asher shalach li yedid libi, harav hagaon hamuflad, nachon lachash v'chacham v'charashim, kavod, morenu harav Aaron Choriner. So this is a little poem that was written by Aaron Chorin, the guy that I just showed you. He was considered to be, again, the halachic authority behind all of this. So he wrote a little poem to introduce Eliezer Lieberman's work. And he started with these words, Ve'ele divrei hashir. These are the words of the song. These are the words of the poem by Aaron Chorin. Okay, come back to that for a second. So, what's in this book? So, piece by piece, claim by claim, he will go through each of the claims that were being made by the Beit Din, by the traditional rabbinate, against those who wanted to open this particular synagogue. So the first one is with regard to those, right, with regard to saying the prayers in German. Again, he's now quoting what it is that his opponents were saying so that he could later refute each one. The second claim was that they were going to omit the silent recitation of Amidah. They were only going to have the Chazan, only going to have the prayer leader say it, right, repeat it. They weren't going to have the individuals say it themselves. Third claim, they were going to skip parts of the Kedusha service in Shacharit of Shabbat. They were going to have organ music in the shul. They were going to pray in the intonation and with the pronunciation of the Spanish-Portuguese tradition. Right? Remember, it's Sephardic, correct? But they are not Sephardic, right? They're Ashkenazi, and so this is foreign to German Jews at this time. Why would they do that? Yeah, why would they do that?
More attractive to.
Okay, so yeah, and we're going to see next week another example of this. This was considered to be almost a higher culture, right? It was something that was going to be more elevated to pronounce things this way, as opposed to a pronunciation which sounds a lot more like Yiddish, right? When Yiddish was considered to be sort of a lower type, right, of pronunciation. Good. All right. Whether that, by the way, is historically accurate or not, I can have that conversation with the Sephardim later. Right, but okay, that's at least what they thought. The sixth claim was with regard to how you pronounce the cantillation, so the musical notes with which they were going to sing the Torah. Right? The seventh was that just acting different from other Jews in the city is a problem, right? And the eighth was that we can't abandon any customs, right, that have been handed down to us. All right, so back to the world of the traditional rabbinate. So the Constitution comes out, the petition comes out, then comes Noga HaTzedek, defending it. Then come the ta'anot, the arguments of the traditional rabbinate, a response by Eliezer Lieberman, and now it's the turn of the traditional rabbis again. But now they have to bring in the heavy hitters because they were sparring here and they needed a knockout punch. So to get a knockout punch, they have to leave the world of Hamburg because there were no heavyweights in Hamburg. They needed to bring in the authorities, the halachic authorities, who could show once and for all that this is not Judaism. And that this is not okay. And so they send a letter out to literally a who's who, like an all-star list of the great rabbis of Western, Southern, and Central Europe. Interestingly, it never goes into Eastern Europe. That's already seen as sort of a different world. Right? But to the rabbis of these areas, this letter goes out and they're asking for help. Please write a teshuvah. Please write a responsa. That is a piece of halachic argument showing that these three things are not acceptable and not okay. That their responses were then put together and they were printed and published in 1819 under the following title: Eile Divrei Habrit. Remember what the introduction, right, to Lieberman's book, it said, Eile Divrei Hashir, right? These are the words of the poem. And so these rabbis respond, well, these are the words of the covenant, right? So your poem is nice, right? But this is the covenant, right? And here we go, right? You can see those who can read the Hebrew, right? Asur, 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 right? Three major things that are asur, that are prohibited. What are they? It is forbidden to change the customary prayer service from the morning benedictions until after Aleinu. You can't touch the service at all, and certainly you can't delete anything from it. Number two, it is forbidden to recite the prayer service in any language other than the Holy Tongue. And any prayer printed improperly or in a manner against our custom is invalid, and it is forbidden to pray from it. And number three, it's forbidden for any musical instrument to be played in the synagogue on Shabbat and Yom Tov, even by a non-Jew. Remember, this is the title page. Okay, this is what the book is about to do. It has collated these responsa that is going to explain in great detail why each one of these things is absolutely prohibited. Now, if I had to ask you, of these three, which do you think is the hardest to defend? Which will be the hardest case to make? One. Okay, why?
It's they're petitioning to the state, and it's, they live in Germany, so why shouldn't some of the prayers be in German?
Wait, that's two though.
Oh, that's two. Sorry, then I meant two.
So the suggestion is two because it's going to be hardest to make the case to the officials in Hamburg that they can't do it in the language of their. Was there another religion that doesn't pray in the vernacular? What religion prays in Latin? Okay, good. Catholicism, right? Protestantism doesn't. That is one of the innovations of Protestantism. They will pray in the vernacular, but Catholicism is absolutely right. They pray in Latin. So there is precedent, not necessarily a good precedent. Living in Protestant Hamburg at the time, but there is a precedent for that. Okay, somebody else wanted to say one. Yeah. Okay. Why one?
Like it was in the Bible, but it's already.
Okay. Suggestion is that liturgy isn't actually, if you open up the Torah, it doesn't say, right, that recite this and then recite that and then recite this. It was the rabbis who came together and put these various pieces together. So maybe that would be hard to defend from a halachic perspective. Everybody's good with this one. 3 feels easy, yeah?
Because you're telling non-Jews something, you're basically giving them a prohibition. You're telling the government, here's something that you can't do.
Okay, so you think that would not have endeared them to the. Well, what about from a Jewish law perspective? Okay, does halacha have any authority to tell a non-Jew what they can or can't do? Right? Perhaps that's out of the realm of the jurisdiction of Jewish law. Okay.
That a non-Jew can relate to because it's not something Jewish. Music and being non-Jewish.
Okay.
They don't care.
Dash, I thought you could actually play instruments. Like in the Bible.
Yeah, we did play instruments in the Beit HaMikdash. Yeah.
That would be my favorite.
Okay.
Maybe the third one because it's related to Deep Shabbat, the way it's literally said to be.
So that makes it hardest to defend?
The third one.
It makes the third.
Yes. Harder.
Yes, the hardest. Maybe.
Okay. All right. So this, though, is what we find. We find a group of rabbis, literally from the top of the top, right, in terms of status in Central Europe at the time. Right? Moshe Sofer, known by his great work Chassam Sofer, right, would be one of them, easily recognizable to any Jew in the time. This is his father-in-law, Akiva Eger, today considered to have been one of the greatest Talmudists, certainly of his generation, really of any generation. This one a little bit less known. His name was Yaakov of Lisa, but also wrote a book called Nesivos HaMishpat, which you go to any major yeshiva in the world today, and this is studied. This is like a basic book of higher kind of analysis of Talmudic work. But of the three, the one that actually sticks out, right? Of the 3 prohibitions, the one that is going to give even these great Talmudists the hardest time was actually correctly number 2. Right? Well done, Anna. But why? Because these are 2 very basic halachic texts. First one comes from the Mishnah. The Mishnah says, the following may be recited in any language. And then goes on to list them, right? The section concerning Sota, the confession made at the presentation of the tithes, the Shema, and Tefillah. The Mishnah, which is the most basic text we have of Jewish law, says explicitly you can say it in any language. And the most basic code of Jewish law that's written some 1,500 years later, the Shulchan Aruch, takes this law found in the Mishnah and codifies it. This is law, which is that it is possible to pray in any language one desires, whether one's praying together with a congregation, right? Sorry, this rule is when you're praying with a congregation. If you're praying on your own, the Shulchan Aruch says, then maybe you should do it in Hebrew. We're not going to get into why, right? But that's not the case we're talking about. We're talking about prayer with a congregation. And Mishnah and Shulchan Aruch could not be clearer that this is okay. So what are you going to do? If you are these three great rabbinic scholars, what are you going to do? Because you have to outlaw it. You have to, right? Your colleagues have called to you for help, right? Any ideas? What might you do? How do you get around this? Come on, there's got to be is there not a lawyer in the room? You have to do it in both. What does that mean?
And in the other language.
Okay. What Ela Divrei Habrit said is that you're not allowed to do it in the other language. So how do I defend that? Kind of says you can, right? Huh?
That's going to mean tradition.
Okay. So let's spell that out. So what would the argument be? Even though this is what it says in the Mishnah, right? And what is written in the Shulchan Aruch, the reality is what? We're going to get to that in a minute. Okay. The reality is that the tradition is such that we've always done it this way. We've always done it in Hebrew. Even if that's what it says. That's not what's been practiced. And there's weight to the way in which we've always done things. Kind of see where this lecture is going? Right? There's weight to the way things have always been done. Okay, I heard another argument in the back. What's the other argument?
I have to change law because there's a new risk to religion being lost. There's a new danger.
There's a new danger. And what would we call that? Meaning,
Koma.
huh?
Koma.
Okay, l'chumra, okay. The argument, though, would be what? That this might not be technically outlawed or prohibited. But if I start to do this, then it'll lead to something else, which is going to lead to something else. And we call that what kind of argument? The slippery slope, right? The slippery slope. So this might be okay, but the implications of doing this are greater than this alone, and that's what we need to be worried about. So let's look at it inside. This again comes from this work, Ela Divrei Habrit, published in 1819, publicly as a way of defending the position of the Hamburg Beit Din to outlaw the new Hamburg Temple. And once we start giving ourselves permission to veer from the tradition of our fathers in any way, what will prevent us from doing whatever we want? Today he will say one thing, and tomorrow his friend will determine it as something else. And one by one, the received traditions of our forefathers will be lost until they are gone completely. And thus our faith will be lost and cut off from our mouths, God forbid. This is the slippery slope argument, right? So it's not about this particular halacha, this particular law. It's about the bigger picture, right? And what this all means. Now, the same author, this is Yaakov Milisa, actually does make a more nuanced argument, which is kind of interesting. He makes the following argument. He says that there is a difference between those rabbis back then who wrote that it could be done in any language and us today. Right? They understood the nuances of Hebrew. They could provide an accurate translation. But we today are not like them. Our knowledge of Hebrew is not on the level that their knowledge was. And therefore, any attempt we make to translate this is going to falter. We're not going to capture the initial meanings, and therefore we'll end up with a sub-quality product. That's a pretty good argument. It's a pretty interesting argument, right? Yes, absolutely, right? Correct. Hebrew is not a spoken language at all, right? Absolutely. But there's also something else here, right? Which says we have sort of fallen, right? There were greater generations that preceded us. We are not like them anymore, and we have to defer to that, right? But then if you look at the end, right, we see something like we saw before, and if one prays in other languages, Hebrew will be forgotten completely. In addition to all of this, they certainly have many reasons that are hidden from us, and whatever they may be, it is a received tradition from our fathers, right? And we don't have the power to change it. Over and again in this work, you will see them moving to this kind of macro argument that it's not about the individual changes, it's about the bigger picture. Another thing that will appear in this is what we might call ad hominem attacks. Who are they to think that they can propose a change like this? Who is Aaron Chorin? Oh, we know him, right? And he knows nothing. He knows nothing. Right? His Torah knowledge can fit in my pinky. Right? Who does he think he is? Right? And it is clear that they are heretics in the foundations of our religion and faith, and in the words of the holy prophets. And the house of the wicked shall be destroyed, and the right hand of the wicked you shall break. And I pray to the living God that he should send his messenger before you to push back those who rise up to uproot the foundational principles of our religion and save you from any further evil in the future. Heretics. Evil.
Why is also living in places where the Enlightenment then really had really infused all of society, or were they in smaller, further?
That is a really good question. I'm going to respond to your question with a question. Why do you want to know?
I'm just wondering if they're living in a place where things have remained very traditional and very, not enlightened.
Yeah.
Then their perspective would be very different than those who are living more modern.
Okay, so let's be clear though that the Beit Din in Hamburg are the ones that are really trying to push back, right? And they're living there in Hamburg, right? But yes, it is true that the people that they brought in are not dealing with us on a day-to-day basis. They're not generally seeing this in their communities, which is going to be an interesting facet that we're going to come to in a little bit. Okay, and last piece that we're going to look at from Ela Divrei Habrit. My brothers, praises your lot. You are blessed to God because you have girded yourselves to fight the battle of the glorious God. Fight the battle. Right? Here we go. Heretics, evil, gird your loins, get armed. There's a battle to be fought here. Right? We are at war. Yeah.
The state who they're kind of petitioning to, they're very patient people waiting for it. It just seems like they probably want money for this thing to happen. I'm surprised that all this was kind of able to take place. It looks like over a year period.
Yeah. So you're surprised that they didn't move. They didn't move faster. I don't know what was the norm for the bureaucracy in Hamburg at the time, but you have to recognize that that to do something like Hamburg, like the Temple Association was proposing, really was a deviation from the norm, right? And to go against the Beit Din, and they were actually not successful. There are three things that emerge from this pamphlet, right, that we begin to see that we can connect, right, that will become three of the core elements of what we will later call ultra-Orthodoxy. Number one, the slippery slope argument. Right? The argument that this is not about the particular issue, but it's about the bigger picture. And if you do this, it will lead to that, right? And that will lead to something else, which will bring us to a place that will lead to the abandonment of Judaism as a whole. And it's important for us to understand, right? Whenever we're looking at a historical episode such as this, we have to put ourselves into the shoes of those who were living there and then to understand that there was no reason to think they weren't right. Right? Who knows? Maybe this would have led to the end of Judaism as we knew it. That's certainly what they feared. So number one was the slippery slope argument. Number two was the invoking of the extremes, right? So it is making something, right, which in and of itself, right, may not have seemed overly serious, right? Okay, thank you. Let's see. There we go. Okay. I'm invoking something which may not have been, right, particularly halachically weighty, right, particularly significant, and giving it increased significance. So here, in particular, the idea that custom has this weight, right, in and of itself. So even if our legal text said one thing, if the custom has been a certain way, that in and of itself is something which needs to be contended with. Right? That's number two. And number three, this sort of battle imagery, right? This crisis. This is a time, right, to grab your strength and fight the good fight, because otherwise, right, everything is in danger. The person who is and will become kind of the leading voice in the fight against these early reformers is a man by the name of Moshe Sofer. Right? Otherwise known as the Chassam Sofer, by the work that he will later write. He lives in Pressburg. Pressburg is nowhere near Hamburg. It is in the Austrian Empire. Bratislava, I think, is its current name. He is the head of the yeshiva in Pressburg. The yeshiva at its time was actually the largest yeshiva in the world at the time, in the 1820s, 1830s. It had a stellar reputation. This is Bratislava in the early 20th century. I'm told that the yeshiva is up the street over there. Never been there, can't vouch for it. But it would churn out students who were widely respected for their Talmudic knowledge. Any Knick fans in the room? Yeah, maybe one, two, okay. Ernie Grunfeld, does that mean anything to you? No? All right. My dad is getting really upset right now. All right. But if Ernie Grunfeld was like a Knicks legend, and he was a broadcaster for them. He played for the New York Knicks. His son wrote a book, I don't know, put out like 2 years ago, I think called For the Love of the Game. And in the introduction, he says that Ernie Grunfeld's grandfather was a student in the Pressburg Yeshiva. Okay, who knew? All right. Moshe Sofer. Moshe Sofer becomes the vocal opponent of the reform movement. So the first question is why? As I said a moment ago, Pressburg is not near Hamburg. And to the question that was asked earlier, Pressburg was not a terribly enlightened place. There were no Reform synagogues opening in Pressburg or anywhere close to Pressburg. So why does the Chassam Sofer take this particular interest in what is happening in Hamburg? Well, the answer, anybody know the answer? The answer is written in almost all of the responsa that the Chassam Sofer writes. And here's where you need to have like a little bit of a historian. You need to know the kind of the tricks of the trade for us historians of halachic literature. This is the way that Moshe Sofer signs his name. You can see it on the bottom there. So this is a tshuva. These are works of responsa, letters of halacha that he wrote back and forth. People would ask him questions, he would respond. And this is how he would sign his name. Like that. What does that say? That's an abbreviation. Right? That says Sofer, and that's also an abbreviation. So you kind of have to know what the abbreviations are. We have some Israelis in the room. What does it say?
What?
What was that? Mischak?
Check, poof.
Okay.
Check. Kodesh.
And that one?
Middle.
No, most people aren't. Don't worry about it. Right? What that says is Moshe HaKatan Sofer mi Frankfurt de Main. The small Moshe who comes from Frankfurt de Main. In other words, Moshe Sofer, who is known as a Hungarian Rosh Yeshiva living in Austria-Hungary, is what? He's German, which means he speaks German. He reads German. He is very much connected with what is going on, right, in the German world. He's from Frankfurt, right? There's a lot, right, for him riding on what is happening. And so he becomes the leading voice. Now, historians will say that ultra-Orthodoxy begins with the Chassam Sofer. That he is, if Abraham Geiger is the father of the Reform movement, well then Moshe Sofer is the father of ultra-Orthodoxy. I do not believe that is true. I think it is a terrible misreading of a genius of a man, right, in the Chassam Sofer, and much of it stems from this little line, which, by the way, he uses more than once, but this particular line that sets everybody going and saying, here is the origins of ultra-Orthodoxy, because he writes in more than one teshuvah this line, HaChadash asur min haTorah bikol makom. HaChadash, Chadash means new. That which is new is asur, prohibited, min haTorah, prohibited from the Torah itself, bechol makom, always. Anything new is prohibited. If it's new, it's bad. If it's new, it's asur, we can't do it. And that is what is ascribed to Moshe Sofer. Now, again, to me, that is a demeaning, right, rendition of the Chassam Sofer. Right? Let me show you what he's actually doing with this line, because it's brilliant. And let's just, and by the way, if you need like a break now's a good time, right? Just get up and stretch. I'm going to explain this, but you can totally tune out, right? And come back. I'll tell you when to come back in, if this doesn't interest you. But Chadash, sure, it means something new. But if you are a rabbinic scholar, you know that Chadash means something else also. Chadash is a reference to a particular Jewish law, which means that grain which took root after the 16th of the month of Nisan is referred to as Chadash, new grain. That grain is asur. You can't eat it until the next year, the next 16th of Nisan comes around. How many people knew there was a kosher law about when grain took root? Right, learned something new today. Okay, so this law is on the books. It's always been on the books. Right? That grain which took root after the 16th of Nisan cannot be eaten. So meaning it took root and then we harvested it, we made bread out of it in the fall or the winter. That bread or pizza or pasta can't be eaten until the next 17th of Nisan. Now there's a reason you don't know that. Right? There was a debate early on, already in the Mishnah, right, as to whether this law applies only in Israel or also outside of Israel. Surprisingly, though, the consensus is that it does apply out of Israel. Some said that out of Israel, it's just a rabbinic prohibition. It's not a biblical prohibition. And if it's only a rabbinic prohibition, then if it's a real hardship, perhaps there'd be more reason for leniency. All of which results in the fact that most Jews never practice this. It's always been on the books. But most Jews have relied on the fact that they were living outside of Israel, and some rabbis said it was only rabbinic, and it is super hard preservatives and packaging to keep your grain for that long, for a full year before you would eat it. How would you ever find grain that was a year old? It was really hard to do. And so most Jews, for most of history, did not do this. The tshuva, the responsa, in which the Chassam Sofer pens this line, was a tshuva about Chadash, about grain, about somebody saying, can we eat new grain outside of Israel? So what does he write? He says, HaChadash asur min haTorah b'kol makom, v'hayashan u'miyushan mishubach mimenu. Which means, either this, what is new is forbidden by the Torah in all cases, and what is old and ancient is better than it, or this, Chadash, new grain, is prohibited by the Torah, meaning biblically, in all places, meaning even outside of Israel, and old grain is better than it. It means both things. And Chassam Sofer was a master of language. He knew it meant both things. And what he was actually saying was that we respect practice even when it is more lenient, not just when it is more strict. Meaning, the reality is Jews don't do this. And we know it. And that has a certain weight. Right? So even the fact that Jews are not observing this, right, has weight in the halachic mind because it's the way that we've always practiced. So the thing that people point to as the Chassam Sofer being the father of ultra-Orthodoxy is actually the Chassam Sofer saying sometimes we're lenient. Right? And that's just the way it is. Right? And that's the way people will be. Okay, now you can start listening again. There are others, though, right, in the students of the Chassam Sofer, right, who will absolutely take this position, right, that all of these things are not only prohibited, but prohibited in pretty extreme fashion. So, this is a tshuva, a response from his students of the Chassam Sofer, right, in which he wants to know, right, he's going to explain how many prohibitions does one violate by imitating Gentiles to any degree in dress or in melody. How many? And in his opening paragraph, he will entertain the possibility that doing this, dressing like, or singing like, or adopting a tune of non-Jews may actually require that one risk their life rather than transgressing. So somebody wants to sing Lecha Dodi to the Beatles, better to die, right, than to do so. Somebody wants to dress in a sports jacket, blazer and shirt that comes from the Gentile world, it's better to give up your life than to do so. Now, he actually lands up arguing that it's not. But he has to give you a reason as to why this wouldn't be something that you had to give up your life. Now, if you want to know the argument is that imitating the Gentiles is a subset of idol worship, and idol worship is one of the three cardinal sins that one does have to give up their life for. There's idolatry, adultery, and murder are the three things that one does have to give up their life for. So if imitating the Gentiles is a subset of idolatry, then maybe the same thing applies and you'd actually have to give up your life for it. And he says ultimately you don't, because idolatry was only when there's an actual idol present. And when I am wearing shoes that were made, that imitate the Gentiles, there's no idolatry. Here it's separate. Anyway, that's the argument. But you can see where this is beginning to go. So we've got a fourth element here, right, that begins to be introduced into this literature, which is heightened consequences for non-observance. That doing these things the punishment is really, really significant. So there's the slippery slope argument. There's the elevation of minhag, of custom. There's the battle imagery, and then there's the notion that if you do these things, you're going to be in real trouble for it. Over the next generation, so we're now the Chassam Sofer dies in 1836. Over the next few generations, the 1840s, the 1850s, the center of traditional Jewry in the Austro-Hungarian Empire will move from the west in Pressburg, where Chassam Sofer was, into the Transcarpathian Mountains of the east. And this is where the next generation of his students, or his students' students, will begin to go and settle and take positions, rabbinic positions. Now, you may have noticed in the postcard, right, what was the description of the man who wasn't the reformer? The one who wasn't German? Chassid. Right? Now, story of what a chassid is, that's a different series, and I'll give it, God willing, one day. That's not for today. But why would somebody associate ultra-Orthodoxy with Hasidim? Why would that work in our story? None of the people we've spoken about up till now are Hasidim. Chassam Sofer was not a Chassid. Absolutely not. Neither were his students. Well, when his students begin to move into the Transcarpathian Mountains, into the east, they will settle in small towns throughout this area, which, by the way, is right on the border. This over the course of the 20th century. Here it says Hungary. It'll become Czechoslovakia. At times it'll be Poland. The Jews stay the same, and the borders keep moving, right? So nestled into these villages are also villages that will become centers of Hasidic, right, thought and Hasidic practice. So I don't know if this means anything to you, but Munkach, right? This is Satmar, where Satmar comes from, right? Those areas are there in Hungary. So you have these next generation of followers of the Chassam Sofer who are setting up non-halachic communities, non-Hasidic communities near these other towns who are Hasidic in their nature, and they will actually come together in 1865. And they will pick this town of Michalovce as a place to sort of bring their leadership together and make a statement once and for all about what was going on, what they were seeing happening, right, in the Jewish world around them. And so this is known today as the Psak Din of Michalovce. So here is the statement that they came out with. Number one, it is prohibited to give a drasha in the languages of the nations of the world. And likewise, it is prohibited to listen to a drasha in the languages of the nations of the world. Thus, any Jew who hears a rabbi or anyone else sermonize in a Gentile language must leave the synagogue and go outside. The sermonizer must sermonize in the Jewish language spoken by all kosher Jews of this country. Number two, it is prohibited to enter for the purpose of prayer into a synagogue which does not have a bima in the middle. So we mentioned that last time, right? This was one of the early aesthetic reforms. They would move the bima from the middle to where? The front. Why? So why is it prohibited? Because you're imitating, right, the ways of the Gentiles. Okay, but now, notice what it says. It does not say that you are prohibited to move the bima. What does it say? You cannot enter into a synagogue in which where this is the case. It is likewise prohibited to enter a synagogue with a tower. What does a tower have to do with anything? Because it looks like a bell tower. A bell tower looks like a church. Okay. It is prohibited to make clothing for the shaliach tzibor, for the prayer leader, and cantors in a way that resembles that of other religions. Remember the pictures we put up last time, right, of the rabbis? And we asked who did they look more like, right? The Western European rabbis? Did they look more like their Protestant colleagues or their Eastern European colleagues? Their dress looks a lot like the Protestant colleagues. Okay, number five, it is prohibited to make the mechitza, which separates men and women, in any way which does not completely preclude the men from seeing the women, as it was done in the past. And likewise, if it is already built, one may not enter into it. It is prohibited to listen to the tefillot of a choir, and a fortiori to pray with them, or to answer amen after them, even if he is therefore forced to pray alone. Better to pray on one's own than go to a synagogue and pray with the minyan, if it involves listening to a choir. It is prohibited to enter synagogues known as chor shuls, choir shuls. As it says in Gemara Shabbos, Rabbi Tarfon said, even if a man is chasing him in order to kill him, or a snake is running to bite him, he should not enter a house of idol worship, and not into houses such as these. We're now equating such synagogues with houses of idol worship. It is prohibited to make a chuppah in a synagogue. They shall be only under the sky. And finally, it is prohibited to change any Jewish custom or any manner of the synagogue which was received from our fathers and our fathers' fathers. This is the Psak Din of Michalovce. This, in my opinion, is the beginning of ultra-Orthodoxy. We see here all the things we described before. We see a slippery slope argument. We see the elevation of minhag, of custom, to actual source of halacha. So things which were never prohibited before are now prohibited because that is the way it's been done. We see the elevation of the consequences in a pretty significant way. But there's something else, right, that is true here that you may not have noticed, which is the whole notion of a psak din. Psak din means the bottom line. This is what is true. This is what has to be done. It's short. Halacha was never written this way before. Jewish law, right, you saw the previous pages where we had those teshuvot, those responsive, they're paragraphs long. Sometimes they are pages long with lots of detailed reasoning about why this is or isn't okay. And it cites source after source after source, right? It's like reading a legal brief. That's what it is. That is not what we just saw. There is no reasoning here. There wasn't. There was none. This was a psak din. This is the law. Right? So these 5 things together will create the kind of underpinning of what it means to live in the ultra-Orthodox world, or the ideology of ultra-Orthodoxy. And this explains why today you can walk through ultra-Orthodox communities. And when I say ultra-Orthodox today, by the way, I mean almost primarily communities in Israel. There are very few communities in the United States, I can tell you there are none in Miami, that would really fit this definition. And we're talking about the really isolated communities in Bnei Brak, in Mea She'arim, in Geula. It's hard to, there are some places like in New York, upstate New York, where you can find this, but it's pretty rare here in the United States. But you walk down the streets in Jerusalem and you see this on the wall, right? A pashkavil, right? What is it? It's isur, prohibited, right? Absolutely, you can't do this. What is this about? What can't you do? Can't watch movies. You can't watch movies. What kinds of movies? Any movies. And they're clear about that, right? Even kosher movies. No movies. Right? So what is this? This is short. It doesn't give you the reasoning, right? There's no lengthy discursus here about why, right? It can't be done at all. It's even if it was a good mitzvah, even if it was a positive movie, it would be a mitzvah haba be'aveira, right? And I can't even read the bottom here, but it's going to tell you, right, that thing, it would be pretty bad, right, if you would do any of these things. How about this one? What does it say on the top? War for God. Milchama Hashem. It's a war for God. What's the war here? That there are people in the neighborhood who are violating Shabbat. Right? There are people that are maybe driving their cars through our neighborhoods. Right? I'm sure you've heard stories of people throwing stones, that kind of thing. Right? What is this? This is the battle imagery. Right? If we don't protect Shabbat, Shabbat will die. So yeah, pick up a stone and hurl it if that's what it takes. Right? This community was built on this crisis mentality, right? And of this battle imagery, that we've got to, and there always has to be something that we're fighting against. Right? This is a community at its core that fights. That's how it was born. Right?
Again, psak din of the Supreme Court.
Yes. Except the Supreme Court wasn't a psak din, it had much more reason. Right? Yes. Yes. And this, of course, explains much of what is going on today. Right? What is the fight against today? Of course. Right? This says, right, that it is mistirut nefesh. Risk your life. Risk your life. Better to give up your life. Back then, it was then to walk into a synagogue with a tower. And now it is then to enter the IDF. Right? Give up your life. Right? Lefidat haTorah Kedosha. Yehudi ma'amin ba'Hashem mekayim b'Torato mitzvotav ein lo eitzah. Rak sheyishbor tanisayon azev misirot nefesh. According to the Torah, and again, it doesn't give you any sources, doesn't tell you how or where. According to the Torah is what it says. Right? A Jew who believes in God has no other choice than to bear this test, right? and be willing to sacrifice their life for it. What is the test? That eineni rotzeh v'lo elech b'shum ofen letzava. I do not want, and I will not, under any circumstances, go to the army. But we understand now where it comes from. Okay. So I'm going to end with two final questions for today's lecture. Number one, if, as I argued, the Chassam Sofer was not of this ilk, he wrote long teshuvot. And sure, he did believe, and he was constantly writing against what the Reform movement was doing, but from a very halachic place. But he was equally resistant to change, both for lenient purposes and for stringent purposes. Why is he known as the father of ultra-Orthodoxy? That's questionable. So the answer to that question lies in this particular work called Lev HaIvri, which is a bestseller to this day in the Haredi world. Lev HaIvri is a commentary on an ethical will. An ethical will is something that's already in medieval times, scholars and rabbis amongst them would write something that one to leave to their children, directions, not a financial will, a monetary will, not telling them what to do with their property, but how to live their lives. And it was a moral tract that people would write to leave instructions for their children. And the Chassam Sofer did that. He wrote an ethical will, instructing his children as to how to live good, upstanding Jewish Torah lives. Well, this work is a commentary on the Chassam Sofer's ethical will, right? Written by a man by the name of Rabbi Akiva Schlesinger. Now, Rabbi Akiva Schlesinger is 2 generations past the Chassam Sofer, and he very much belongs to this group in the Psak Din of Michalavcha. So what does he do? He takes the words of the Chassam Sofer and he writes a commentary in which he very much introduces this mentality and way of thinking into this text, which the text had been a text of Moshe Sofer. So these are the words of Rabbi Akiva Schlesinger in 1868. Changing any of our father's customs, even if it entails no resemblance to the practice of the Gentiles. Follow that? No resemblance, right? Or any other prohibition. Nonetheless, to change from that which was received from our fathers is completely prohibited. So it's not what the Chassam Sofer was saying, but it's what 2 generations later, Akiva Schlesinger is saying it in the words of the Chassam Sofer. And know that anything which is done in order to change the customs of Israel so that they should resemble the way in which the Gentiles worship, he transgresses several negative commandments, and it is more severe than eating pig in quality and quantity. In quantity, eating an olive's worth of pig is only 1 negative commandment. Changing and switching customs in order to resemble those of the Gentiles transgresses many negative transgressions. In quality, because these negative commandments of resembling the Gentile are an aid to idol worship, and there is a possibility that they might fall under the category of die and do not transgress, meaning what the Mecholas HaMachanayim, the other piece that we saw, raises a possibility but ultimately rejects, Akiva Schlesinger raises and does not reject. There is a real possibility, he thinks, right, that you might have to give up your life rather than imitating the ways of the Gentiles. And it is a great sin to make a tower on a synagogue. Besides the great sin of resemblance to the practice of Gentiles, for which one transgresses 7 negative commandments and 2 positive commandments, it is also rebellion against God and public desecration of his name, and there's virtually no atonement. All of the elements of ultra-Orthodoxy can be found in this text, which is written as a commentary on the words of the Chassam Sofer, which explains why today people look to the Chassam Sofer as the father of ultra-Orthodoxy. But this is the bigger question. Why now? Aren't they late to the game? Haven't you memorized the table that I put at the beginning of the lecture? They're late to the game. This was 1840s. This was 20 years ago, where they were having these rabbinical conferences, right? And they were talking about, we don't need any more ceremonial law. We don't need a Mashiach. Right? Only the Talmud moves in circles. We, however, favor progress. That was 20 years earlier. It just now? They're figuring this out? Over the course of those 2 years of conferences, we saw Kol Nidre be abolished. We saw references to the return of Zion eliminated. We saw them go to the triennial cycle of the Torah reading, modern baths instead of the mikvah, organ played by a Jew on Shabbat. Are you noticing something about these things? These aren't even the things they're fighting against. Psak Din of Michalavcha doesn't say that somebody who walks into a shul where they're playing an organ on Shabbat is like he's walking into a shul into a place of idol worship. He says, if you build a tower, that's not even 1840s, that's like 18 teens. By 1846, they said it's okay to violate Shabbos. They said we'd only have to do 1 day of holidays, not 2. That's nowhere in the Psak Din of Michalavcha. What is going on? Good question, right? The answer, back to the same text. This is Rabbi Akiva Schlesinger, writing in 1868, about all the things that are wrong, right, with resembling the Gentiles, right? Well, here's one more paragraph in that same text. And similarly, sometimes they seduce by saying, just as one is required to fulfill his obligation to God, so too he is required to fulfill his obligations to man. And tov Torah im derech eretz. That means, how good is Torah together with the ways of the world? They seduce you by saying, live a life of Torah, and you can also live in this world. Actually, you have to. You have to fulfill your obligations to God, and you have to fulfill your obligations to man. Reformers were saying that in 1868? No, they were not. But there was one very, very famous rabbi who was saying exactly that. Does anybody know what his name was? Don't worry, I do. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch. Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, right, will lead a very different group of Jews. And in fact, the motto of his congregation will be Tov Torah im derech eretz. Torah is good together with the ways of the world. This story, right, is the story of neo-Orthodox Jews. A different group who are going to arise during this time period, who will stay committed to Jewish law, but who will look and dress and sound in many ways like their non-Jewish colleagues. I believe that the better way to understand the birth of ultra-Orthodoxy is that it was not a response to Reform Judaism. It doesn't make any sense as a response to Reform Judaism. It was way too late. It makes a lot of sense if we understand ultra-Orthodoxy as a response to neo-Orthodoxy. And in fact, I'll go a step farther, right, and say that Yuvo got it wrong as well. That this postcard with which we started, sure, that's an ultra-Orthodox Jew, but that is not a Reformed Jew in the 1920s or 1930s. His head is covered. I think that's a tallis bag over there. This is a shul behind him. That is not a Reformed Jew. That is a neo-Orthodox Jew, a German neo-Orthodox Jew. And the split between the two, the split between the Orthodox Jews of Germany and the Orthodox Jews of Central and certainly Eastern Europe had grown so great by the time you got to the 1920s and 30s that you needed a Rosh Hashanah card that said Orthodox Jew to Orthodox Jew. Put out your hand, say Shana Tova to each other. And can't we all get along? And so it's this story of neo-orthodoxy that we will tell next time. Good night.